Broadcasting from Great Gate Studios, it's time for Connected with Lori. Tune in every other Wednesday to learn about the future innovation of technology and advanced tech trends. Here is your host, Lori Caruso.
Hello and welcome to Connected with Lori. I am your host, Lori Caruso. On our show, we highlight the future innovations of technology. Well, we're going to do just that on the show today. We're so excited to talk about all sorts of technology, as well as we're going to get into a conversation about the real deal on 5G. For years, we've been talking about 5G. What is it? What in the world is 5G? I remember being the first question. And then the next question, how are we going to deploy it? Now, we want to know, what can we do with it? And on our show today, we're going to talk just about that. I'd like to welcome Dustin McIntire, CTO of COMSovereign. How are you?
Great. Thank you so much for having me today. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. So thank you for being here. All right, I've got to know, because I know you know, where do we stand with 5G today? I mean, we've been talking about it for a long time, right?
Right. Well, that's true. If you watch the commercials today, you'd think it's a done deal, right? It sounds like basically all I got to do is go out to the store and buy myself a phone and it's all set. So let's kind of walk it back a little bit in terms of the timeline. So in reality, the standard really didn't come to a sort of final phase. It's an evolving thing, but the latest generation of it, we'll say, didn't really come to ink until the middle of this year. And to be honest, most of the prior deployments that went on, we'll say earlier in the year, we had heard some of that, were based on the pre-standard stuff. So it really wasn't mature at that point. We're just now getting into what I call the tip of the iceberg. So what is 5G today? 5G today is really just faster cell phones, we'll say. You know, that's interesting, but when you think about where we want to go, 5G is a much bigger story. It's about all the things we can't yet do with our network. So today, I'd love to kind of have the opportunity to walk through some of what those applications may be, the services, all the stuff that really is on the future and on the horizon, I think are the interesting part. Right now, we're, again, kind of talking about being able to download things on Netflix, but in reality, 5G is a much bigger story.
It is a much bigger story. There's no question, since we've been talking about it as long as we have. I know I've been in this industry for an awful long time, and I don't remember having the same conversations about 3G, 4G. So I'm curious, what's the difference between 3G and 4G compared to what we're talking about now with 5G?
Great question. I mean, if you look at it and you walk back to kind of generationally, what each of these evolutions or generations have been pointed towards, they each have had their own function. 3G was really more about global networks. How do I get my voice, take it with me, and be able to make phone calls from across the planet? If I want to go to Europe, or I want to go to Australia, or I want to go to Asia, how do I talk to people? We solved that problem in 3G. 4G was more about the emergence of the cell phone, right? How do I get data to something that I carry with me? It's all about smart apps, being able to do things that I wasn't able to do before with this thing in my hand. Well, so we kind of got to the point where now we've got a portable data device in my hand, but now we take it the next step further, which is, how do I enable services? How do I do things that are useful to me in the network? So 5G is really about taking all of the things that we take for granted and pushing them out into the environment. How do I enable new and interesting applications that aren't necessarily needing to be held in my hand? Some of the examples that people talk about are, autonomous vehicles or smart buildings, things that go on in the environment that I'm not necessarily aware of. That's kind of where 5G wants to be, which is taking the user engagement and pulling it out into more of a ubiquitous service environment, so that these things kind of go on in a way that is more transparent to me as a customer.
Makes sense. So I'm also curious too, as far as deployment, I know we have quite a few products that will reside on 5G. We need to have the 5G network to be able to make sure they're working properly. How are we doing as far as the deployment is concerned? And are we keeping in line with the demand on the products?
Yeah, that's good. In terms of where we're at, right? We talk about a lot of new and emerging technologies. You hear about things like artificial intelligence and smart something or other, all of these other assets that are going to be built on top of 5G. Sometimes the confusion is thinking of 5G is the thing in terms of all of these other discussions that go on in terms of future technologies, we'll say. 5G is really sort of the platform that they all live on. So in order for a lot of them to become reality, we have to build out this new infrastructure, this new paradigm of networks, which is traditionally the network was built with a core where everything went into the core. All of the work was done there, and then all of the information had to come back out to the customer. So it was this kind of sort of like a spider web of infrastructure. Now we've kind of flipped that around and said that doesn't scale very well for things that we need to be fast, things that we need to have a lot of information moving in and out, and things that need to have a very low latency, meaning I need to turn them around quickly. So instead, we flipped the paradigm around and we pushed a lot of this out into the network. Things like edge compute and some of these other aspects are really intended for us to be able to distribute all of that information in a much more efficient way. So all of those things we talk about in terms of the autonomy and the virtual reality and the artificial intelligence, those are really only enableable by having a lot of that compute and capability, the services that are deployed in 5G out towards the edge. So really the 5G story is about creating this new architecture that all of this other stuff that we talk about becomes enabled by. And so it's really sort of the glue that's going to hold it all together, but it isn't necessarily the thing. It's really more of the enabler for all that stuff.
The enabler, that's a really good way of putting it, because like I said in the beginning, what is 5G? We always were questioning that. We knew it was going to exist. We knew that we were working on it. We knew we had, deployments happening, but then could we really answer that question? What is it? So that was great, actually. Thank you for that. So I'm also questioning too, as we're deploying and we're putting so much effort and so many things and technologies into this network, do we have to worry about cyber threats? Do we have to worry that, it could come back to affect us in a malicious way?
That is truly a concern, right? As we, as a species, become more connected, not only through our communications to one another, but also just in general to the things at large in our lives, right? So we have sensors all around us, whether it's cameras or whether it's thermostats, whether it's sensors in my vehicle. All of these things provide information about me, or potentially could be used in ways that I don't find it, secure. So there is certainly a lot of work going on around how we more robustly secure our information. So certainly as this paradigm of 5G, and again, as we take all this information, which was once brought into a central location, essentially collected, processed, and distributed, that model where you can build a wall around the information, because it's all essentially in an island, if you think of it that way. I build my island, I put my wall around it, now my information is secure. Now we start distributing information into all of these little pockets around the world. How do I secure that information? I don't necessarily have physical access to it. I can't guarantee that nobody else has physical access to it. I don't necessarily even know where the information lives. So we have to change how we do these things. And so there's different efforts going on, things like zero trust and software-defined perimeters, and these notional constructs that we're working on now, which take away the trust model, which used to be, I trust everything inside this wall because I know I built it, to once I can establish with you, I know who you are, you know who I am, and we have established a trust relationship based on some service that we want to provide to one another, that then we use that as a way to build out a construct for a larger trust model. And so we have to change how we do things in order to minimize the exposure one might have if there is some intrusion into the network, or there's some malicious actor who comes in and wants to get something. If we've got one key and they get that one key, they have access to everything. So we've changed it now. Everybody gets their own key, and those keys only open one door. And so we've tried to then contain the amount of information that's distributed to a way that is only useful for that particular thing I'm trying to do. So we have to flip around our model. We're working on it. I think there's a lot of people, very smart people, working on how that works. Certainly all the stuff around quantum computing and all the other things that are going to potentially have disruption in the encryption models and all the things that we built today is concerning as well. But I think we are slowly working that into how we build up a solution based on a new way of doing things, which is a more atomic unit of trust versus a global trust structure that we've built in the past.
Well, I see a lot of questions out there when it comes to that. I'm also hearing a lot, and we had just touched upon artificial intelligence, AI, and how we're going to use that information and what is going to reside from a technology standpoint. Maybe you can talk a little bit about, what your thoughts are for future demand on AI, and where are we going to go with that?
Yeah, so AI is certainly one of those buzzwords that's been propagated almost probably, I would say more than 5G at this point, right? If you look at the hype curve, AI is probably at its peak as well. There has been a lot of very interesting technology that has come out of this recent thrust, right? AI goes back decades. It goes back to early work from the 70s, really, where we were looking at different models of being able to build out relationships that don't necessarily work on a binary construct, right? How do we probabilistically put things together? How do we build networks out of that, neural networks and whatnot? And now we've kind of worked through the fact that we have these massive computers with lots of cores being able to do things independently. Now we can throw this large amount of information, essentially filter it through and create these networks in a much larger scale. All of that stuff really depends upon having a tremendous amount of information, right? So AI, as we as individuals learn, requires repetitive action. We need to do things. I don't know what something is until I've seen it multiple times. AI is built exactly on that construct. Instead, I throw millions of pictures at something and eventually it can figure out what it is. So when we think about 5G and AI and how they come together, AI is going to depend upon that information flow. So in order for it to learn, in order for it to really understand its environment, all of that information has to be collected in a way that it can bring it in, understand, learn, change its model, and then take action upon that. So that's kind of where this whole edge paradigm comes into play, because if you think about our environment and how much information sits out there, the only way for something to have a local view of the world that relates to the information and actually contains value in terms of what it's deciphering about the environment requires all that information to be localized itself, but it also needs sort of a global picture of how it works in the world. And so you just put these pieces together. 5G, again, is sort of that underlying fabric that puts the information in the right place at the right time so that AI can do its job. And that's kind of how the two will work together. Fascinating.
But I have to use another word too, somewhat intimidating. I have to say, when you're talking at this level, and, this is great for me. I learned so much from my guests, and Dustin, incredible information here, but I'm intimidated. I'm a little scared. Is that something that's normal for people to feel? Because I'm
right. Well, technology is intimidating. I'll be honest. It's new, it's different. It's something we don't necessarily understand, but originally I was scared of this thing, right? So, and now I every 3 minutes, I got to pick it up and look at it. So that's the amazing thing about technology, is that it starts out as an unknown that we are afraid of in some sense. And eventually, if it's done right, it gets so baked into our normal day-to-day, we don't even realize we're doing it anymore. People don't even realize they're staring at their hand probably more than they're looking up where they're going. So that, to me, is the same sense of, where does 5G go from here? 5G will be, gosh, I'm going to have all these things living in the network that are trying to outthink me, or it may be doing stuff that I don't want. It might be driving my car. All of the stuff that right now sounds like science fiction, scary stuff. It's going to turn on me and try and destroy the world, all of these notions. But, in reality, it's a very slow process. It isn't tomorrow all of these things just magically exist, and I'm forced to kind of live in this world. So we as a species are going to slowly bring this into our environments. We're going to get used to it. It is going to adapt. We will find that we eventually don't even realize it's there, right? Successful technology is invisible. So from the standpoint of where 5G really succeeds for us, is when those applications and services become localized and really personalized to us as an individual, and we don't even realize that it's been done. So, I could be walking around out in the world somewhere or other, and there's a catered network to me because it knows what I want. In the same way that I install apps that I find interesting on this phone, it's my custom little portal to the world. Well, I don't necessarily need this anymore as I walk around out in the world. Maybe it just follows me. So that's kind of how I see eventually this transgression of moving from my portal to the world to the kind of environment itself, or the network moves with me as I travel through the world.
Ease of use right there. Pretty incredible. And I definitely want to get into maybe talking a little bit about smart cities, exactly what you're saying, what we do now when we leave the house, when we leave the office, and what follows us. I want to get more into that in a little bit after this short message. We'll be right back.
Zenfi Networks is an innovative communications infrastructure company focused on enabling fiber optic network edge co-location, and wireless sitting solutions in the New York, New Jersey metro region. As the area's most experienced communications infrastructure builders, Zenfi Networks has an unparalleled reputation for efficiently architecting and delivering solutions that enable mobile network operators, wholesale telecommunications providers, and large enterprise clients. With its purpose-built C-RAN infrastructure, Zenfi Networks is at the forefront of network architecture innovation and a critical part of the mobile and wholesale telecommunications ecosystem in one of the biggest, most important markets in the world. For more information, please visit www.zenfi.com.
Hello and welcome back, Dustin McIntire from COMSovereign. I'm so excited to have you here. And we were just before the commercial break started to talk a little bit about technology following us, not necessarily being on our cell phones anymore and being, in the office, in the house. Now we're leaving these locations and you're talking about the technology following us. Let's talk a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. So I think one of the critical aspects in terms of what is going to be different in terms of 5G and why that relates to where we as a company are going is that if you think about where we exist right now, it's essentially a fixed network with mobile people. We have a bunch of infrastructure. We have what are called MNOs or mobile network operators, our big guys, the Verizons and the Sprints and the T-Mobiles of the world, who provide that service to us. They spend a tremendous amount of money putting up infrastructure into the world to cover as much of the populace as they can to provide them service, which is basically everything I can push through typically a smartphone, potentially other things like in my home wireless communications, etc. But if you think about, from my perspective, where the sort of natural progression is, there are limits to that model. That model extends only to the point where it's financially tractable or feasible for those people, for those MNOs, to want to go into environment. There are places it just doesn't make sense, whether geography makes no sense, it's too difficult to put fiber optics in the ground, or microwave transmission doesn't have a point-to-point connection, there are not enough people. There are all sorts of limitations where it just doesn't make sense. The government has tried to sort of force that or encourage that through these rural broadband initiatives. So they basically write checks to get people out there to try and do stuff. But in essence, there's just not enough money to make it 100% coverage across everywhere it needs to be. So there's always this problem of there are holes, and it doesn't necessarily create this confidence of ubiquity everywhere we go. So to me, 5G kind of flips that a little bit from the standpoint of not fixed networks, mobile people, but potentially mobile people with mobile networks. So the network itself doesn't have to be fixed anymore because I have all sorts of new assets, right? There's things like the non-terrestrial networks. We've all heard about the SpaceX and all of the sort of satellite stuff going on with respect to all of the services that are now being rendered either through satellite. There are also, aerostats, either free-flying aerostats, tethered aerostats, basically balloon-type concepts where people float things in the sky, UAVs. And so we have this concept of moving pieces in the sky. But we also have, I think, eventually what I believe to be a main differentiator is this bring your own network concept. Right now, the only way I get my 4G or whatever it might be is that I go pay a bill to somebody else and they build the network and I push my data through their network. I think the real differentiator in 5G is I don't necessarily want to have to be stuck in that model anymore. I want to be able to take my network, bring it with me, establish a connection, and use my own system. Sort of like the way we do with Wi-Fi in some sense, right? That we don't pay anybody for the connectivity aspect. Of course, we have our internet side of it, but we kind of own our own network. And so 5G is looking down that road. We've started in things like CBRS and some of the others, which are kind of a democratization of spectrum, if you will. But I think we have a long way to go. And I think eventually things like rapid deployable solutions where I can go out into an environment that has no connectivity, provide my local high bandwidth connectivity, whether it's sort of smart sensors or IoT or whatever I have locally for AI enablement and those sort of things, but then also a tether back to the real world, whether it's through satellites or whatever, those sort of applications where I'm not dependent upon someone else to provide the entire solution, but rather I can facilitate my own solution, either as an enterprise or as an individual. All of those things allow me to have the confidence that I'm able to support my application without necessarily being dependent upon someone else to help me do that. I think from my standpoint, that's going to be a real differentiator, because 5G opens the door to that in a lot of ways, because it's the standard has been set up to be fair, if you will, around the different technology components that people can work with. Don't necessarily require you to own the whole infrastructure. You can build pieces, parts. So I think from that standpoint, there's a huge shift that will go on as we start looking at the horizontal ability to be able to move into different spaces without having to build the whole vertical. You don't have to own the whole solution. You can kind of stitch things together, if you will, in a more homogeneous way.
Yeah, and I'm sure the strategy of deployment and what, what the MNOs were looking at, back in the beginning of the year to today with the pandemic has changed. I would imagine it's changed because, here they're focused in the cities, they're focused where the population exists. And now that people are remote, working from home, or they're actually moving to remote areas because they're so nervous and scared, that has changed the whole landscape of deployment, and probably just came to a screeching halt and said, wait a minute, we need to do and refocus. So tell us a little bit about maybe how the pandemic has changed things.
It's a very good point. I think you brought up, we'll say, a vision or a view of how these things would come to pass a year ago. And I think a bit of a reset of that as we look at it from today's perspective, right? So 5G originally, we were going to go heavy into the cities. That's where all the people are. The challenge is, if you kind of talk about the deployment strategies from their side of the house, is it's crushingly expensive, right? We're talking about potentially 10 times the more gear, if you will, that has to go out there in order to support what we're trying to do. And if you just kind of start to add up the dollars and cents, it's an incredible amount of money, right? So how does one justify that if we are looking at a population who isn't necessarily vested in staying close to their point of their work, their office, their home office site? They're really, if you look at the housing movement this year, there's been a huge exodus from the cities. People are looking to go into suburbs and rural and whatnot. And so the population sort of de-urbanized, if you will, or starting in that trend. And I think it'll probably continue depending upon how long we stay in the paradigm we're in now. But from that standpoint, right, you have to look at the model that it's built on, especially if we were heavily invested in the millimeter wave, the FR2 stuff, which is a very short range. So your equipment costs go up as you start to expand the scale of your network. We may have to kind of look at that from the standpoint, as I mentioned earlier, how do we lean on things that give us a little bit more broadness of the solution, whether it's the non-terrestrials, whether it's the lower frequency FR1 stuff, whether it the mobility aspect of the network not necessarily being tethered to fixed equipment. How do we allow people to sort of support themselves in a more sufficient way?
Absolutely. So I'm also curious too. I've gone to your website, I've taken a peek at what you are managing today and some of the portfolio that you have. Tell us a little bit about COMSovereign and where you're going directionally.
Yeah, it's an interesting story, because when you look at it from a first blush, we'll say, it may not completely make sense because it is a non-traditional approach. We are a newcomer to the space. We have not been around that long. Essentially composed of what I would say are early technology components or vectors within the umbrella of 5G. So if we start with the understanding that 5G is an idea is not that mature. We're still in very baby steps, year 1, year 2 of a sort of 10-year type phase. So really the only applications that have major traction or significant traction at this point are the obvious ones, the MNOs selling more handsets so that I can get more bandwidth to my phone. But the interesting stuff kind of comes in the following years, right? In the next 3 to 5 years is where we start to do cool stuff. And so from a company, we saw that as a huge opportunity, because that's where small technology investments can really be agile, adaptive, and collaborative, synergistic across different things that are needed to be brought together to solve problems. So we have sort of the approach of, we need communications equipment, basic radio technologies, so filling in the space from the access side to the backhaul side to how do I create the presence of communication. But it moves well past that, because I have to worry about now in terms of how do I support power into an infrastructure that may not necessarily be tethered into municipality, or may have some mobility aspect to it. Infrastructure that may not necessarily be tied to a building or a tower somewhere? How do I support that aspect? So we, have drones and aerostats and all those sort of vehicles that you can use to support that communication system. And then behind that, you have to think about, well, if everybody has this tremendous amount of bandwidth, where does it all go? How do we move it? The current fiber in the ground just won't support that capacity. I mean, they're rolling out tremendous numbers of fibers at this point into the ground, but eventually those run out of gas. They're exceedingly expensive. And so we've been putting in a lot of investment into real groundbreaking stuff with relation to optical communications, kind of next gen type stuff, which really kind of moves us beyond some of the boundaries that we've hit over the last 10 years. The fiber optic side, the bandwidths have been incrementing up, but they really haven't made that real leap to the next generation. So we're working in that space. Same thing on the wireless side. We've kind of played out all of the vectors that we can work through, whether it's higher modulation densities, whether it's the bandwidth of a channel. And so we've kind of worked through all of the different dimensions. And so we're trying to work on some of the last bastions there, which is the in-band full duplex and some of the other parts that I think will also enhance some of the next gen pieces, which if you've heard of the integrated access and backhaul, which is sort of that idea of, I liken it to a mesh Wi-Fi system. So you're able to take your infrastructure, you don't have to tie it in through fiber optics or cable anywhere. You put them out into the environment and they're able to sort of establish a network and relay information through it so that I can create that coverage without necessarily doing all the pre-planning in the beginning. So all of those pieces will come together longer term, and that's where we're trying to establish ourselves as a kind of a leader early on. As the space slowly matures, we'll be able to bring those technologies to bear as kind of having those early pieces in place already.
I love the future innovation and vision. And you're absolutely right. I mean, we're talking today, right, on a typical basis, but what does it mean for us in 3 to 5 years? I mean, it's happening quickly. We're deploying quickly, but what does that mean? And the cool stuff, like you had said, you do have really cool on cutting edge things that you're working on. And I know today's podcast was primarily talking about, the educational piece on the network, 5G, what it does for us. But I would love to get more involved, maybe on another podcast, with some of the future innovations. Like that's my podcast, what we have to try to explain, but the future innovations, what we're going to see from you guys in the next 3 to 5 years. So one last question I have for you. I want to hear about the killer app that you think is going to be next. What do you think the future holds for us?
Well, I think that was, as I said, the mobility aspect. That's really where we need to think outside of smart cities. We need to think outside of the AI aspect to where does the mobility part of the network come to play? How do we take the fact that we are tied to a network now, and how do we move that to an environment where I'm no longer tethered to the here and now, but rather I can bring it with me.
Pretty exciting, I gotta say. Well, Dustin McIntire, I really appreciate you being on the show today. I would love to have you back sometime soon because we have a lot more to talk about, don't we?
I think that would be great. I would love the opportunity to come back. I love telling these stories, and I appreciate your audience bearing with me on this.
Oh, absolutely. We enjoy this. This is pretty incredible to me. I've learned a lot. Thank you so much. And thanks for joining on Connected with Lori.
Interested in being part of our show or advertising on our podcast? Contact us at info@fifthgenmedia.com for more information. We'd love to be a part of your success.